Brian is smiling. This man who's obviously being subject to issues about what he's allowed to publish or not publish or say. But
yeah, this will be an unlisted video, and it'll only go on the community, site. But I'd forgotten to do that before, so my apologies to everyone because we just missed a bit of profound stuff from Jim. But essentially, to summarise what Jim was saying there, he's really saying that real leadership is about seeking out feedback, and it's about being willing to hear it, even if it's terrible.
Well, it's also making an assessment of ensuring that when you're listening to someone, trying to understand whether they've earned the right to be critical of you.
Yes.
If someone hasn't earned the right, you should not allow them of making you feel worse as a result of their criticism.
Couldn't agree more. And something you said earlier, Jim, was about seeking feedback's more important than giving it. If I'm repeating you correctly.
Well, I believe that seeking feedback is important.
Yes. Yeah. Anything to add, Brian? Yep.
Obviously, being receptive to feedback too when they come forward, you're modelling that. That's a good process to do as well.
Indeed.
Being receptive to all those things, because as Jim said, some people, if you don't give them the opportunity, they'll be telling someone else about it. So just got to be receptive and take it on board. And sometimes people will be in that conversation and say, well, actually, that's not exactly right either, if other people are hearing it.
Yeah, and it's that kind of candidness, and that's what we want.
Mm.
And
well, honesty.
We want that. And over the years, for many years I was about candid conversations, and sometimes I was very blunt in my own conversations. I just say what was on my mind or what I thought, and what I discovered was that you got to be convivial as well. That puts a bit of fun in it. It keeps it nice. That's not to say that we can't be involved in hard-nosed conversations from time to time. I mean, I think for example, I've just been through an intensive program with a couple of mentors over a year, where once a month, it was painful, but it was at a deep level where we were exploring deep and meaningful, important things, and I was asking for feedback, even though it was hurting me. But I think that's Go ahead, David.
I'm just saying that's what Jim's saying. You're saying. I think everyone's saying the same thing there. I think the general rule of ignoring feedback you didn't ask for is still a fair comment. But what Jim's saying there before is, I'd be open. Like, if you're open to feedback and you're seeking it, well, that's different to receiving feedback you didn't actually ask for. The only issue with some feedback, we talked about this the other day, Ian, is when you've got someone that's formed a cognitive bias against certain aspects of a certain person, and they're making comments that are out of context. And if they're doing that, then I think everyone would tend to agree with the fact that if the feedback's not in context with what you're doing, or isn't relevant to what they're trying to say, well, then I think the feedback you didn't ask for is a fair way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think, that in itself is a useful conversation to have. This depends a lot on the maturity of the team, the willingness of the team, the openness of the team members, and so on. But a conversation about cognitive bias and bias in general is a good one to have it in any team, because the more we can be aware of it and eliminate it when it comes to decision making, the better decisions get made. We've all got bias based on our beliefs, preferences, experiences, etc. And that's a part of being a human. But it's valuable to have conversations about it when you've got the level of maturity at a team level. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to move on a bit. After action reviews are another great conversation. The term originally comes from the US military, but we won't let that stop it from being a good idea. And this is part of where, if you can see on the screen there, when you're after action reviews, the idea is keep the review focused to one particular action. You might use the process which is in other parts of the manual, the appreciate, imagine, and so on cycle. And there's some suggestions here. Really, are the results or outcomes of the action validated? Are they real? Then what can be done better and by whom? How will we implement improvements? What metrics? And an interesting conversation I'm having with a number of clients recently is the difference between a measurement and a metric. And I might just open that up a bit in a moment because I think it's an important one. And then, how will we integrate these steps into other conversations? So I think an after action review is a very, very powerful conversation, and it's very useful prior to making a decision. And I put in just a basic decision-making model that comes out of the Change What's Normal book because I'm dumbfounded the amount of organisations I see who actually don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually talking to 3 senior executives in a more than $100 million business the other day, and they were struggling over a decision that they asked me for help on. And I said to them, well, let's start by having a look at your decision-making model. And everyone in the room went like this because they didn't have one. It staggers me, Jim, that senior people don't have a process to follow to make major decisions. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so I've stuck that in there because I think everyday decisions should be made by people at the source. I think that's a given. But when it comes to major decisions, there should be a process. Do you agree, Jim?
I do. If I think about work that I've done with like strategy plans with organisations, when we've done, and often we do decision models, the focus of the conversation is on your step 2 in the model. What do we agree are what I call what is worth being considered to be put through the decision-making model and what's not? What are the criteria by which we make that? Because otherwise we spend all of our time inside a decision-making model and not getting on with business. So You need to decide what goes into it. And then secondly, when something's in it, how do we get agreement around what I call the tests that we apply to determine how we end up going through all the 3, 4, 5, 6 and before we get to the 7, but making the decision. And that's actually a lot of discussion and generally hard work.
Yep.
Get people to agree with all those. What are the values, the goal plans, the costs? What are the factors we consider that will affect the acceptance or non-acceptance of a decision? Not easy, and I wouldn't. And I reckon I'd make that 2. I'd give it a lot of time to make sure 2 is agreed by everyone that counts.
Yeah, interesting. You'll see if you subscribe to my blog, another great book. I'm going to have to revise my top 21 reading list that I put out a week or so ago because my current, as well as looking at deep work, which I put up before, David. I think if you can see that on the screen. But I've started to study Meta Skills by Marty Newmer, who has written a number of great books. But he has a great model called the Strategy Pyramid, where at the top of the pyramid, he puts the purpose of the organisation. And underneath that, he puts the vision and mission of the organisation, which he has a beautiful way of describing how the 2 are different. And then underneath that, he puts the goals and plans and so on. I find it a very useful way to look at, because in purpose-driven organisations, and purpose being, what's the cause beyond profit, organisations that are really clear about that purpose have less trouble making decisions, particularly if they're clear about the mission and vision. And I find a lot of people, when they have decision discussions, they haven't done the work, Jim, as you say in number 2, and they haven't even thought about how it lines up with purpose, mission, and vision of the organisation. You know, the bigger picture thing. So, in lots of cases, the conversation's not worth having in the first place because it doesn't.
Well, that goes back to in one of your earlier sessions, Ian, where you sort of focused on the Simon Sinek, mate, that people have to have a why.
Yeah, indeed.
You know, or the Viktor Frankl, man's search for meaning is fundamental to anyone being motivated to do anything with their lives.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So, and that really, I think, an earlier point I made somewhere up here earlier. I think about. Up here, if people have job descriptions, I prefer to call them role clarity statements. But the number one thing that should be on a role clarity statement is what is the purpose of the role, and how does that line up with the purpose of the business? If you haven't got that, then conversations, you know, are not going to be as strategically gifted as what they should be. And so often, you know, I find when teaching organisations about communication and conversation, the starting place is what's the purpose of the organisation, and what's the purpose of the roles of the people in the room. That's the place to start. But that's probably a bigger subject than we've got time for today. But it often conversations or reviewing things or making decisions, often a lot of the angst can be avoided just by lining up with purpose, whether that's organisational purpose and or individual purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I see you smiling, David.
Well, I noticed there was a little friend come on the camera there.
Yeah, Bruce just wanted to get on the show. I just had to push him away. With that purpose, Ian and Jim, what you're saying, you know, in the schools we do annual implementation plans, and when that gets finalised, everyone's had input leading up to it, and the purpose is clear, and then it's up there in the staff room or wherever it is. So whatever you're doing, it's all related to getting to that purpose. And if it's clear and there is clarity, you generally find that there's not that much confusion. But if no one really knows what's going on, it's chaos.
Couldn't agree more. And one of the reasons for these different conversations is often to remind people of purpose, which is why weekly check-ins are probably my favourite conversation, because these are short, sharp weekly meetings, online or in person, where, you know, we're just reviewing what's happened and what's next. And we're agreeing on actions and accountability. I've got one client who's got 18 direct reports, which is a lot. That's about to be changed. We'll only have 2 and they'll each have 7. But to save a lot of time and energy, we've been really working on these weekly check-ins for some time now, and I've been sitting in on some of them as the mentor. And it's interesting how so many times the conversation got distracted because purpose wasn't clear or wasn't at the forefront of the conversation. So we often say now the purpose of this meeting today is, and we state the purpose. We're going to review what's happened about X, Y, Z, you know, blah, blah, blah. And we might reinforce the purpose of the organisation or the purpose of the person's role. So there's a number of suggestions there. Schedule these things in advance. Meet for no more than 15 minutes. Answer the questions. Confirm the actions. Update people's performance plans. And if appropriate, update their PDs or role clarity statement. And important is they're not about you, they're about the member of the team. And you should be having weekly check-ins yourself if you're the leader of the team.
So, Ian, an obvious question in relation to this particular point is why weekly? How do you define the right frequency for what I call the frequent touching base of people in a team working together?
Yeah, excellent question. And probably for the more experienced people, weekly would be a metaphor to say, the point is it's about frequency. And often, for example, in the case of the team I just mentioned, now that they got really good at weekly, we're now saying, well, we only need to have these fortnightly. And probably in a while, that only needed to be monthly. But I find the habit of weekly becomes frequency, which then can be decided when the team's mature enough to be whenever. I think the points are that they're scheduled, they're not sort of ad hoc, they've got an agenda, and so on. So it's more of a metaphor from the more experienced leaders, I would say, Jim.
Okay, so you're just saying the maturity of the team, the amount of change that's going on, how often they sort of understand each other and how they're going. The more developed and deeper the understanding they have of each other's performance, the less is the frequency of what you've defined here as the weekly check-in.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah. Having said that, I still find, I know with a lot of my regular clients, that weekly check-in that I have with them is an important part of our relationship. And it reinforces some of the things, like by asking, well, what's worth celebrating this week, Jim? And that they will tell you. And I might say, so that was probably something you put in your diary when you did the gratitude exercise, or whatever else we might have agreed on. And then what can be better? It's still a valuable conversation to have. I mean, how would it be if you didn't speak to your wife for a week?
It wouldn't happen. I'm in a household of women. It's never going to happen.
No, well, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I guess the point. Yeah, but I think mature people, you kind of know if it's becoming a bit monotonous and the power's been lost, then you obviously got to take the point. It's about frequency and so on. Obviously, mentor moments are important. I'm often asked what's the difference between a coach and a mentor, and I've given a longer answer in the Change What's Normal book, but I think in essence one's about will and one's about skill. Both are important. And you can read the longer answer in the Change What's Normal book if you want. Personally, I mainly meet with mentors, and mainly it's once a month. And I will choose coaching, as a specific thing that I will go to for a specific person to, improve a skill. Like for example, sometimes if I'm to do a major presentation that I haven't done for an organisation before, and I'm using new material, I will often go to a speaking coach to test the water and get feedback and so on. And I think it's important to be aware of, particularly David, in your case, you're a mentor yourself, and the idea of reverse mentoring has a lot of traction in the workplace today. That is that, younger people are mentors to older people. It's gaining a lot of momentum. I think it's very important. And the bottom line is that every encounter we have with a human being is an opportunity for learning or unlearning or relearning, so don't waste it. Mm-hmm. But having it formalized, I think, is a good thing. And then the last one is, be a member of a mastermind group. I mean, Jim does this for a living. I have my own group. I don't know any senior business person or person who's serious about their growth who wouldn't be a part of a mastermind group or a peer group of some kind. And I guess that's part of what I'm endeavouring to do here in the community, is to run these, once a month, where over time we become more peers, and we help each other, to get better. I first came across this idea when I read Think and Grow Rich 35 years ago. And I straight away went out and started a group with a bunch of mates. We used to meet in a spare room at the back of the shed of one of my mates' houses, and it was one of the best things we ever did for our lives. In fact, it was one of the early men's group, and the guy that wrote Manhood, Stuart Biddulph, wrote up about that first mastermind group that I started in that first book, because men weren't doing that 40 years ago. And so I've been involved in groups ever since. And I've had the pleasure of speaking to lots of groups like Jim's and the Executive Connection and other CEO associations and peer associations. So, and I think Napoleon Hill himself, he nailed it. No two minds ever come together without thereby creating a third invisible, intangible force, which might be likened to a third mind, hence the mastermind. So I know, Jim, I'm preaching the converted, but even in the cricket club, David, this is an important.
Well, it's funny you say
factor.
that, because I suggested this morning to our from the 16 coach, who's also our club coach, which we master. I didn't call it mastermind. I called it master batting class tomorrow night training. Not involving batting, actually just sitting around talking about how you go about batting. I know it's not work related, but at the same time, the sharing of ideas for these opening batsmen. We've got under 16, we've got second 11, we've got first 11. Just talking about how you start your innings and what you're thinking. Sharing those ideas and then getting a common method on how you approach your innings. I reckon just that general discussion, it's sort of similar to what you're saying.
There you go. There you go.
As a result, aren't you? Yeah.
Talk to Justin Langan, you'll find that's what the Australians do. So if it's good enough for them, why wouldn't it be good enough for Redan?
I was batting on Saturday with a couple of kids who were going to be extremely good, but they just get stuck on strike. And I just think it's because of the way they're thinking. And here I am older, and I just tell them, you just got to change your approach, and you got to be looking to score and where the ones are. Don't get worried about going out, worry about scoring. And it's a bit the same as being at work, I suppose, in a way. Like, you're sitting there, don't be scared of making mistakes, be more proactive in actually doing and, try different things and develop new ways of doing things.
Well, what emerges here, David, is what Napoleon Hill called the third or invisible intangible force. Covey called it the third alternative. You're all familiar with Stephen Covey. Everyone knows the 7 Habits book. I think his 2 best books weren't the 7 Habits. His best book was The 8th Habit, which is about gratitude. And his best book, according to his own thoughts, was the book called The Third Alternative, which he wrote, or it was published a year before he died. So 2011 publication, he died in 2012. It's the same concept, and I've described it as, in the diagram there, we end up with a higher purpose view. So when we're having a conversation, your view is important and mine's important, but ours is even more important, which is, I know my wife and I, we've been married for 43 years. This is a key to our relationship. My view is important and her view is important, but ours is more important.
Actually, achieving 43 years of marriage is already an important milestone.
Well, we were fortunate to learn this concept a very long time ago. And in organisations, this is the significance of shared view, as I call it, as you know, but it's the same principle. The third invisible intangible mind, the mastermind, or as Covey called it, the third alternative. And it's like, this is the world today. We're in an either-or world, whereas the secret's in the both end.
Yeah.
And
the
so
more you have in the team, the more you have in your team in the hours group, the more achievable it is to make progress.
Absolutely right.
You know, so that hours group is most important. It might be 90-10 or 80-20, but if the hours is a majority, they influence the others, and it just becomes a nutrition rate, or they change their mind.
How do you do that? So, like, I've got a cricket club board at the moment, and we're struggling. We've got a very large number of players and a lot of challenges, and we're going up against some other pretty strong clubs at the moment. But I feel like I'm the only one trying to be positive, and we've got our coach at the moment who's very negative, and he's a bit over it, and he's had enough. But he's probably the most influential. So that ours view is almost his view, if you know what I mean. Like he's.
You don't have that view, so that's why it's going to be difficult until that changes.
Yeah.
Well,
honestly.
You and I look, David, I might be able to help, and there wouldn't be any. I'm not talking about a chargeable thing, but because I'm a past cricket club president, I kind of know what you're going on, and I'd be happy to come along when it works for both of us and have a talk about how it can work. Because I remember going back, this was one of the things that made the Tea Tree Gully Club, when I was the president and Terry was the coach, this is one thing that made us successful. Because Terry and I came to an agreement that on the field was his responsibility and off the field was mine. Just 1 second, would you please? I'll call you back, Jim. I'm just in another meeting.
Jim's on the phone here.
Okay, bye.
That's different Jim.
Yeah, I asked him to call on because I'm a bit later than what I thought it would be, but my apologies there to both.
I think that'd be helpful, Ian, by you using that experience at a club like that, because you can talk from experience.
Well, I mean, as you know, when Terry was just out of jail, he had a huge ego. We didn't know one another then. As you know, we became best friends. But, you know, the only way we could sort this out was I said to him, whatever happens on the field, you're accountable for. What happens off it, I'm accountable for. And we're not going to interfere in that. And we're always going to have a shared view. Now, it took a while, but, you know, we got there in the end. And maybe I can help. But
I think you could.
We'll see. So
it's sort of that's the reason I bring it up, because I think it is relevant to what we're talking about here, because it's exactly the same in the workplace. You have an influential person, and they sort of influence how everyone else thinks, and they don't necessarily have to be the person in charge.
Well, this last action might be helpful, Dave, because I would say whether it's a cricket club or Google, you need written status of what shared view is in these 7 areas. Because I know when I take a look at organisations and when I help them on an ongoing basis, if one of these is missing, whether it's your marriage or your cricket club or your business, if there isn't a shared view in these 7 areas, optimum performance is not possible. And often it's the third one that causes all the trouble.
Yeah.
You know, what's the purpose? And I know at Tea Tree Gully, the purpose of the cricket club was to, and we spent a lot of time on this, but our purpose was to produce players for Australia. That was what our purpose became. And so anything that wasn't along with that purpose wasn't considered. And I would often say to Terry, will this help us produce players for Australia? If the answer is no, end of discussion. So that higher purpose became the driver. So then it became, well, will this produce players for South Australia as it was in those days? And so on. Will this help us to take a junior to be able to play in the first, and so on? So it's all these kind of things. So business, marriage, cricket club, get a shared view in these 7 areas and use the conversations to get you there.
Good questions.
So I've gone a
What
little.
are you saying there about if you got that purpose conflicted, and you haven't got that shared view, obviously it's difficult to get there. I suppose like when you're answering these 7 questions, you'd spend the most amount of time on that number 3. In order to do that, though, you need to know 1 and 2 first. So obviously, that's always done in that order. Is that right? Or,
It could be, David, that as you have done with your teammates at work, you might use the appreciating what is exercise and the imagining what can be exercise that's in the handbook that you've used with your work team. You might use that with the career club, because I would say at the moment you've got the coach and probably a few other people who aren't aligned in these areas, and therefore that's where the trouble is.
Yep.
Anyway, we can talk about that offline. So before we conclude, anything else that you'd like to talk about? Question?
Ian, I think you've covered some good ground, Ian.
Yep,
and,
absolutely.
and I want to say I appreciate a statement of appreciation for giving more depth to those whole areas of conversations. Certainly in the leadership work that I'm responsible for, there is one theory that says we are our conversations, and actually breaking it down to us thinking about how each of our conversations need to be thought of in terms of questions and actions. I think is a very effective way of bringing that to the surface.
Yeah, and look, I think these are all designed at a pretty fundamental level to make them approachable, but the deeper you get into them, the more things emerge. And I would probably agree with that sentiment. We are our conversations. Conversation with ourselves, that's,
Yep.
that goes right back to ancient wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you all. Next time, I'll put out a note. We're going to start to explore the enhancing their gifts concept, both other people's and your own, and how all that works. So I look forward to seeing you next time. My apologies that we didn't get all this recorded to those that are going to watch this, but next time I'll make sure I push the button earlier.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, all the best. Bye, Dave. Bye, Brian. Bye for now.
yeah, nice to meet you both.
See you later.
Go Redan.
Indeed.
There we go.
Okay, we're all back off. I'm just going to stop that recording.